Hi there. We are back talking about grammar today. So today we're talking about the appositive phrase. You've done prepositional phrases with your students probably at this point, and that's a good entry point into phrases. You also touched probably on phrases to some degree when you were talking about adjective phrases and adverb phrases. Hopefully at this point your students are fairly aware and understanding the concept that a phrase is a group of words that functions as a part of speech. And you might want to reiterate that even going into each of these lessons on phrases. The appositive phrase is a good place to go after prepositional phrases because it is the appositive phrase will function as a noun and it's going to rename another noun. So you're really just working with nouns here. Now, it does get a little bit tricky because an appositive phrase could have an adjective in it and some other things, but the whole phrase will be working as a noun. So that's what I want you to keep in your mind as you're presenting this lesson to your students, that it's a phrase working as a noun to rename another noun. So we have our warm-up game. Here we have the Name Your Price game, which we did in a previous lesson, but just to remind you that you've got a scenario and you can kind of open the floor to your students. How much would somebody have to pay you to do this? They can each write down a number. You can kind of see who's his highest, who's his lowest. They can guess what your price would be. There's a few different ways you can have fun with this game. So you have two different scenarios, and then in each one, I point out that there is an appositive phrase in that scenario. So I think just point out the appositive phrase. Don't spend a whole lot of time going into what it is here because it's a little bit more complicated of a concept and you don't want to confuse them right off the bat. But just mention, here's an appositive phrase in our question. And then you've got another, well, this one I do ask if they can spot the appositive phrase, and you can see if anybody is familiar enough with appositive phrases to spot it. And if they are not, again, totally fine. Do not confuse them right away because that's what the whole lesson is about. So here's our definition of appositives. Again, like I said at the beginning, an appositive, it's a noun or pronoun that describes another noun or pronoun right next to it. It's renaming that noun or pronoun right next to it. And a little helpful tip is that a lot of times they start with a, an, or the. Just a little tip. So here you have examples. T'Challa, the king, fought tirelessly for the people of Wakanda. So you've got T'Challa is your noun. Right next to it, the king is the appositive that is renaming that noun. And then the last dance, that's your noun, the subject of that sentence. A documentary, another noun, renaming what is right next to it. Okay, and then appositive phrases, of course, are just groups of words doing the same thing. So the whole group of words is functioning as a noun to rename that noun. And it will be right next to the noun that it's renaming. So her favorite football player, the whole thing is functioning as a noun to rename Tim Tebow, which is right next to it. Like I mentioned earlier, it could be a little confusing because in the actual appositive phrase, you might have an adjective or something else, but just try to reiterate the idea that the whole thing is working as a noun to rename that noun. The whole thing is a person, place, or a thing. And so a group of words is actually functioning as a single part of speech. And this is a concept that we'll come back to a lot with the phrases. The whole phrase is acting as a single part of speech. Now, there's some comma rules here, and I would introduce these comma rule concepts. It is important to know how to punctuate your sentences for clarity. And so the comma rules with appositives are that a restrictive appositive phrase does not need commas, but a non-restrictive appositive phrase does need commas. And so you've got some notes there that you can explain to your students. And the next slide has examples, which makes it a little bit more clear, I think, when they can see the example. So here you've got Katie's teacher, Mr. Hutchinson, served in the military. Well, if you're thinking of a high school student who has a lot of teachers, we need to know which teacher we are talking about. So just saying her teacher, if she's got 6 teachers, doesn't tell us who we're talking about. So that's a restrictive appositive. And in that case, it doesn't have commas because it's got to stay in that sentence for clarity. But in the next example, Stan's biology teacher, Thomas Kent, served in the military. Well, you've already said that it's the biology teacher, so we don't actually have to name him. So that means Thomas Kent here, this appositive, is non-restrictive, or like non-necessary is a way to think of it. You could take that out and this sentence would still be clear who we're talking about. So I think of it in my mind as if there's commas around that appositive or that appositive phrase, you could just take it out. But if there's not commas, it needs to stay there. So introduce these rules. Try not to get too in the weeds with the rules. And what I mean by that is don't let your students be defeated because we're talking about commas, but introduce the rules and then assure them that as you start to practice writing with appositive phrases, you'll revisit these rules. As they write their own sentences, they will revisit these rules. They do not have to master it on this one slide. They're going to practice it when we get further into the lesson. All right, so this slide just asks, why do we use appositive phrases? Does it affect style? How can it make your writing be better? These are just things they can have in their mind through the rest of the lesson as they're looking at the mentor sentences. So we've got a few mentor sentence slides. In this first one, I have underlined the appositive because it's a long appositive phrase, and I want them to see that an appositive phrase can be long, so I draw their eye to it. But you can still talk about the sentence, and you can still talk about what that appositive phrase does for that sentence. So spend some time chatting about that. The next slide, I have underlined one of the appositive phrases in that sentence, and one of the appositive phrases I have not underlined. So you can start to see if they're getting it, if they can find that appositive phrase, and then also if they can see what that appositive is renaming. And then there's one more example where I don't underline any of the appositives, and you can see if they can find the appositive phrase in that sentence. Then you're going to move on to just a little bit more scaffolding before we get to the practice. And I have found that this just helps students going into making their own sentences. So spend a few minutes. You can do this as a full class, just verbally, but see if they can think of a way to rename these nouns. So for instance, Michael B. Jordan. Well, a way to rename him would be to say an actor or my favorite actor. So give them some time to do this verbally. How could you rename my shoes or the song? The song, I'll Fly Away, or my shoes, the white sneakers. So just walk them through how you can rename a noun with another noun. Then move into your mentor sentences and your sentence frames, where they are only filling in an appositive or an appositive phrase to rename the noun that is right next to it. So you have a couple of practices for them to do that. And then you have a picture and a clip that they will then write a few sentences about, to including their positive phrases. So I apologize, this video was a little bit longer than the other ones, but I think it's important just to be clear on some of those concepts that might be a little bit tricky for them.